Talk of a ceasefire falls on deaf ears as Israel pounds a shell-shocked Gaza from the sky. Violence rages into a second week as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vows to press on while Washington muzzles the UN Security Council. Have Palestinians been abandoned by the international community, and is a lasting peace more distant than ever? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmakers, Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Now, fighting that began over forced evictions in Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem has reignited a battle that's filling the skies with rockets and bombs. More than 60 children are now among the hundreds dead. Israel's military says it struck more targets in Gaza in the last 7 days than it did in all of 2020, with no clear end in sight. Israel's president says the tension between Jewish and Palestinian Israelis could devolve into civil war. And yet Israel vows to continue its military operation, called Guardian of the Walls, until the entire military and civilian infrastructure of Hamas is destroyed. As in past conflicts, the international community has mounted a weak response. And as Natalie Pohonen reports, civilians are once again paying the price.
In the pitch dark, and as day breaks, there is no escape in Gaza from Israeli air raids. It's a new day, but Palestinians can only be left to wonder, will it be as deadly as the ones before? The offensive between Israel and Hamas has entered its second week. The Israeli government says it will continue to strike at terrorist targets in Gaza. But it's Palestinian civilians who are paying the ultimate price. Because in this densely packed enclave, there's simply nowhere to shelter from that kind of air power. At Gaza City's Shifa hospital on Monday, doctors were struggling to take care of the injured brought in after an Israeli airstrike. This woman says she and her husband fled to a relative's house near a school, thinking it would be safe from the bombing. She survived, but her husband didn't. Sunday was the deadliest day so far. 42 Palestinians, including 10 children, were killed in air raids. The Israeli military said the civilian casualties were unintentional. They say they had been targeting a Hamas tunnel system. And when that collapsed, so too did the homes above it. One of the survivors was 6-year-old Susie Eshkuntana. She lost her mother and all 4 of her brothers and sisters. Her father, Riyadh, was rescued. I was filled with all the anger of the universe, he says. But when I heard that one of my daughters was alive, I said thank God, because this girl might capture some, even a little, of my other daughter's smiles, because she is their sister.
This latest round of violence only perpetuates the cycles of death, destruction and despair, and pushes farther to the horizon any hopes of coexistence and peace. Fighting must stop.
That plea comes as more than 200 Palestinians and 10 Israelis have been killed so far. The calls for Hamas to stop launching rockets at Israel and for Israel to stop bombarding Gaza are only getting louder. All eyes are on Israel's strongest and biggest ally, the United States. Earlier, it blocked a UN Security Council joint statement calling for an end to the hostilities. Now there's been a slight shift in tone from US President Joe Biden. In a readout of his phone call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Biden repeated his firm support for Israel's right to defend itself and, for the first time, expressed his support for a ceasefire. But it's not an ultimatum. Netanyahu has signalled that public pressure won't dissuade him from his mission.
We'll do whatever it takes to restore order and quiet and the security of our people and deterrence. We're trying to degrade Hamas's terrorist abilities and to degrade their will to do this again.
But the cost of each new day of this offensive means more civilians having to endure the unthinkable. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank is Hanan Ashrawi. She's a former PLO executive, a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council, and ranks among the most prominent figures in Palestinian politics. Thank you so much for being with us. Let me start, or try to start, I should say, with the glass being half full, if that's possible. You've seen everything over the course of your now decades in politics and as a Palestinian civilian yourself. Is anything different about the conflict this time that could lead to any real sense of change?
Yes, I think there is something different. Actually, there are things that are consistent and persistent patterns, like the use of unbridled violence by Israel, the bombing, shelling, destroying people's homes and lives, the indiscriminate killing of civilians, women and children. That is a constant. It's not the first time it happened. It's happening all the time. But what's happening now is that Israel has gone in many ways too far in provoking the Palestinians, starting with the issue of Jerusalem and the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem, the targeting of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the lobbing of tear gas grenades and stun bombs and so on inside the mosque itself, coming in the wake of a systemic escalation of settlers storming the mosque and the Haram Sharif. This has inflamed Palestinian public opinion, and at the same time, they escalated the issue of land confiscation, of ethnic cleansing. As I said, the area of Sheikh Jarrah was specifically targeted in order to kick Palestinians out of their homes and bring in Israeli Jewish settlers under the pretense that there were Jews living there before there was the state of Israel. Well, if they were Palestinian Jews, number one. And number two, if you look at all the documents, there were no homes there before Israel was created. So it's ridiculous. But anyway, this is part of an ethnic cleansing. So what's happened was that a constant escalation, a constant creation of facts on the ground, stealing more land, demolishing more homes, and so on. What's different now is that they went too far. They now provoked all Palestinians, all Christians, all Muslims, all Arabs and anybody in the world who has conscience. And there's an emerging new vision. There's an emerging new spirit. There's a reality now that says all Palestinians everywhere are not going to lie down and die quietly.
Okay.
This has to stop. And there is now a price to be paid for Israel. But Andrea, if I may say so, I think the most significant thing is the mobilization and revitalization of this younger generation and of all Palestinians in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, in Gaza, in 48 Palestine now, and all over the world, whether in refugee camps or in exile. And at the same time, the mobilization of a tremendous network of solidarity and support.
Okay.
So now the Palestinian issue is out there. This is important.
Help me then better share this vision you have with you. Tell me what will tangibly change when the violence subsides in Palestinians' daily lives in Gaza. You think it will get better? It had to get worse than before it got better. But then what will we see tangibly change?
Now, unfortunately, I don't think it will get better in terms of Palestinian lives in Gaza, because the tragic part of it is that, as you said earlier, it's all the innocent civilians, whole families. They're the ones who are paying the price, and there is such massive destruction and devastation of infrastructure, of high-rise buildings, of people's homes, and so on. And things like basic requirements in infrastructure, electricity and water, and so on. So to the point where people have to start rebuilding their lives again. You remember in 2014, Israel killed thousands of Palestinians. Whole neighborhoods were demolished. And we spent years trying to rebuild, trying to restructure that reality. And the whole international community was asked to help rebuild. So we kept saying, deal with the causes, not the consequences.
And you know, sadly, because of the disproportionate military strength between, obviously, the parties involved, Gazans are likely to lose a lot more. And knowing that Hamas is not interested in a ceasefire under the current conditions, even while they know Israel will continue to strike. Tell me what you think Hamas stands to gain by continuing this conflict.
Hamas changed the rules of the game because Israel was used to acting with full impunity. It was used to killing and destroying at will and not paying any price. And you'll be surprised, even Palestinians who disagree with Hamas are saying, this time it's different. Hamas is telling them, you cannot keep doing this and getting away with it, that there will be a response. And there will be a response in kind, because Israel is the superpower, if you will, of the region. It has the strongest army, and it continues to use it against a captive civilian population with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. So now, even those who disagree say this is very important, because now we're sending a message that we do not want to be passive victims.
Okay.
That has increased support for Hamas.
So,
but at the same time, has awakened a real Palestinian sense of resistance, of pride, of identity. And Israel had tried to say that Palestinians are dormant, that we can tame them, we can bash them into submission, and so on. Now it's realizing that generation after generation, and this youngest generation now, are coming out and saying, that's it, it's enough. So I'm saying deal with the causes. Deal with the Israeli occupation, with Israel's ethnic cleansing. Recognize Israel for what it is, a colonial outpost.
But it's about, in essence, what you're saying, it's about sending a powerful message. However, that message will come at a huge cost. And I have to ask you if you realistically think Israel will care about that message when it justifies its actions by saying it is fighting Hamas, an organization that is listed as a terrorist organization by the United States and the EU. So does Israel genuinely care what the message is?
No, Israel doesn't care, but it will care when it has something to lose. Netanyahu escalated because he really wanted to avoid having another person form the government. He wanted to avoid going to prison. And he said he thinks that he can subdue Gaza once and for all. Now, he doesn't talk about Gaza or Palestinians. He uses the term Hamas, Israel, Hamas. And Hamas are all terrorists, and therefore they deserve what's happening. This is the usual spin, what we call the Hasbara. And it's all lies, by the way. If you try to analyze and critically assess the public discourse of the Israeli government, you will see how half of it is lies and the other half is distortions and manufactured spin. But anyway, he's saying we're fighting Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Everybody who gets hit is hit because he or she is associated with Hamas. Therefore, they deserve what's happening to them. There's no question that they're doing this. And of course, saying that in a state of self-defense, which is ludicrous, it's absurd, another spin. And the US is repeating that because they want to rescue Israel from being held accountable by the ICC. Because when you say this is self-defense and you keep repeating it, then you are allowed to use it. But that's the thing. The Palestinians of Gaza are suffering and will suffer. And the Palestinians of the West Bank are suffering in a different way. And in Jerusalem they are. And in exile and refugee camps they are. So either deal with the totality of Israel's brutality and occupation and impunity and its status as a rogue state with preferential treatment, or this is going to repeat itself until the world and the people realize that the main source of instability, insecurity, violence, and lawlessness is Israel.
Hanan Ashrawi, very unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us on the Newsmakers. We appreciate it. Now, to look at the broader ramifications of the conflict, I'm joined from Amman by Ali Abunimah. He is the co-founder of the pro-Palestinian website, the Electronic Intifada. And from Jerusalem, we have Daniel Seidemann. He is the director of Terrestrial Jerusalem, an NGO that tracks developments that could impact the peace process. Thanks both so much for joining us. Let's begin then with the role of the international community here. And the U.S. and others, as we know, are calling for a ceasefire, but to what end? The violence may stop, but all the underlying issues will still be there. Daniel, let me start with you. Go ahead.
Well, international involvement is indispensable, but it is entirely inadequate so far. The noises coming from Washington calling for a ceasefire are not treated seriously because apparently they're not serious. Were there to be serious engagement from Washington to the effect that there will be consequences on Israel unless there's a ceasefire, there's not going to be a ceasefire. So I would say that the international involvement is absolutely indispensable and until now, totally inadequate.
Okay, Ali, are you on the same page?
Well, not quite. First of all, it depends what we mean by international community. Usually that term means the United States and its satellites and client states. And when it comes to their role, we need less involvement, not more, because the US is deeply involved in this slaughter in Gaza. The Israelis are using American bombs, American warplanes, American weapons that the US government is actually now planning to send more of. They just considering in Congress replenishing Israel's bombs. The European Union is the same. It aids, abets, arms, and funds Israel's regime of apartheid and colonization and occupation. The rest of the world does need to step up, however, and there I would agree that more involvement is needed in the form of isolating the pariah regime that is bombarding Gaza now, ethnic cleansing Jerusalem, and shooting dead Palestinians wherever they exercise their absolute right to resist and self-defense against this colonial regime.
It's interesting, Ali, I'll stick with you for a second because many are actually very worried that too many foreign interests are now involved, not least Iran openly backing Hamas. Are you fearful at all that this could become just too much of a proxy battle between foreign powers and actually further escalate the situation rather than de-escalate the conflict?
Well, no. The core of this is that it is an anti-colonial struggle. Palestinians have been resisting Zionist colonialism since the first European Jewish settlers came to their country with the intent to dispossess Palestinians of it. And that's the core of it. Iran has supported Palestinian resistance, and Palestinians have a right to resist, just like French and Belgians and Italians and Europeans resisted against occupation. Palestinians have a right to resist. And if countries are not happy that Iran is supporting Palestinian resistance, they could step up and support Palestinian resistance. But even better would be to end support for Israel's colonial apartheid regime and stop giving Israel the bombs and the weapons to murder entire Palestinian families in their beds, as Israel is doing now, for no other reason than to teach the natives a lesson. What Israel is doing now is exactly what colonial regimes always do. If we kill enough natives, they'll get the message that there's no point resisting us. Well, 100 years of massacres have not succeeded in quelling Palestinian resistance.
Okay, Daniel, there are those who argue right now that this is not about Palestinian resistance. This is about fighting Hamas. Where do you stand?
To be honest, I don't know what this is about. Last night, Israel's Security Cabinet said, this will not end until all of our objectives are achieved. But what are those objectives? They haven't been defined. Hanan speculated that perhaps this is about Netanyahu's political survival. I can't rule that out. I'm not entirely sure about it. But it is clear that the Palestinians will not be beaten into submission. There will be a ceasefire at some point. The question is, how many dead need there be unnecessarily before that ceasefire takes effect? And when that ceasefire is put in place, we will be exactly where we were beforehand, with perhaps changes in perception in the international community. Gaza will still be an open-air prison. The West Bank and East Jerusalem will still be occupied. and we will be facing scorched earth.
Right.
No better off than we were before.
And, you know,
nothing will have been achieved.
And Daniel, I mean, Netanyahu said the objective is clear. It's about degrading Hamas, but obviously you can't degrade Hamas without degrading all Palestinians. And now there's this issue that the president pointed out in Israel about the situation devolving potentially into civil war within Israel between Israeli Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. Is that a possibility, or do you think slightly an exaggeration?
Had you told me 3 weeks ago that we would be in the situation we're in now, I would not have believed you. It is clear that this is an earthquake. It's an earthquake domestically in Israel. We've never confronted this before. People who at least had the illusion of being good neighbors 2 weeks ago are now engaged in violence. Part of this is indeed a display of Palestinian solidarity. Mr. Netanyahu has devoted his adult life to erasing any border between Israel and Palestine and creating a one-state reality without equality. And we know what the term of one-state reality without equality is. That's apartheid. And we are now discovering that when you erase the green line, it goes in both directions. Okay. And we are going to have to start from scratch in rebuilding whatever possible relations are between ourselves, Israeli Jews, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are Palestinian, will remain Palestinian, and will display solidarity with their Palestinian brothers and sisters under occupation. We better get used to it.
It's no easy task. Ali, let me ask you, in the meantime, we have Arab countries who signed agreements to normalize relations with Israel, and initially they argued that these agreements would somehow give them greater leverage over Israel to help resolve conflicts. I mean, has it? What are they doing now to show that that leverage is actually there?
No, of course, it didn't give them more leverage, and it wasn't intended to do that. These were opportunistic deals by dictatorial regimes that people have no control over. So when the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and Saudi Arabia, although Saudi Arabia has not done so openly, got married to Israel, so to speak, they thought they were doing it over the dead body of the Palestinian cause. They all thought that the Palestinians had been sidelined, that Israel had found a way to, quote unquote, manage the conflict, and that the Palestinians had no leverage. And what they've all discovered is that despite the immense firepower that Israel has, the immense political support it has from Western elites around the world, the Palestinian people are very much alive, and they're determined to resist with whatever means they have. Gaza has been under siege now for almost 15 years, and yet Palestinian resistance organizations are capable of mounting a military response to Israel's siege and occupation and ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem. It is a fraction of the firepower that Israel fires at Palestinians. But nonetheless, I think that it will create a new balance where Israel will know that it does not have a free hand to go ahead with ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem without the potential that 6 million Israelis will be hiding in bomb shelters, that its main airport will be closed, that its economy will suffer immense damage, and its image around the world will be totally destroyed. Israel isn't a very popular country around the world, except with Western elites. But right now, what we're seeing around the world is a huge upsurge in revulsion at this regime that wantonly destroys the offices of media agencies, that kills doctors, that bombs clinics, that bombs civilian homes, that brings down high-rises, that takes its revenge against an entire society for having the temerity to demand its freedom from an apartheid regime.
Daniel, go ahead.
Netanyahu's endgame is more of the same. Netanyahu's endgame is keeping out of prison. Netanyahu's
that's not
endgame is
sustainable.
managing the conflict indefinitely. My endgame is ending occupation. Occupation is the greatest existential threat to Israel, much greater than any external military threat. And therefore, I had problems with the normalization process to the extent that it purported to marginalize, ignore, and do away with the Palestinian quote unquote problem. It's clear that that's not working, that there's no walking away from this conflict, that you cannot ignore Jerusalem, and certainly you cannot ignore Al-Aqsa. You ignore Jerusalem at your own peril. And Jerusalem always has the last word.
Okay.
So what we will need to do when this is over is clear away the debris and look how to proceed in a way that will end occupation for the sake of both Israelis and Palestinians.
Daniel, I will have to give you the last word. Very unfortunately, we are out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you both so much for taking the time to be with us. And of course, to our viewers for tuning in as well. We'll see you next time.